Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure for me representing the Austro-French Center for Rapprochement in Europe to welcome you to today's webinar, which I think has a very interesting and also very timely topic when we talk about European strategic autonomy, or are we talking about new dependencies? And of course, the topic will cover the issue of dependence on Russian gas, on American pressures, and the Green Deal, which was recently also a great topic in the European Parliament. And I am particularly grateful to our partners who are and also joining us for this seminar, in particular the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, WIIW, and IFRI, Center for International Relations in Paris. When I say it's a timely topic, then it is, I think, a bit because contrary to what a lot of people would believe, the topic has not received as much attention in recent weeks and months as one would have expected. And the question is a bit, why is that the case? When Russia invaded the Ukraine in February 2022, obviously the issue of strategic autonomy, which has been around for quite a while and which was originally discussed more in the context of defense, all at a sudden made it very clear that what we are really talking about were dependencies not only in the defense sector, but also in the energy sector. And particularly, obviously, the dependence on Russian energy, most importantly gas, became an immediate issue. I think what we have seen was quite some progress in Europeans weaning themselves from dependency of Russian gas, which was the case for most European countries, even including Austria, which was heavily dependent. Not really for two countries immediately to the east of Austria, Hungary and Slovakia. But it is still an issue which is very much with us and which, of course, has wider implications. It's completely linked, in fact, to how we can really achieve energy independence, going beyond dependence from Russian gas. And of course, there are some other aspects coming in. The fact that we have found alternative suppliers also raises the issue whether we are talking about new dependencies. I mean, the trade agreement which the European Union reached with the United States obliges us to buy 750 billion of LNG from the United States. And while this can be seen as a welcome diversification, the question is, do we really have an energy policy which would enable us to talk about European energy autonomy or even sovereignty in something of the near and medium term? And of course, it's also an issue which was linked very much to the Green Deal. And in some respect, it was even seen as an opportunity to advance the Green Deal by weaning ourselves from Russian gas and therefore being obliged to look for strengthening the renewable sector and looking for alternatives. But I think one of the reasons why maybe the energy issue, even though it very prominently features, for instance, in the Draghi report, is one of the sectors where Europe simply needs to strive for more unity and a really independent and European energy policy. But I think it has been overlaid a bit by other factors, like dependence on strategic supply chains, for instance, in the digital area, in the area of rare metals and materials. So I think the fact is that we simply have, sometimes we talk about a multi-crisis. We also talk about the multi-dependency and a multi-vulnerability in many areas. But I think that's even more reason to come back a bit and focus on the energy sector in all its aspects, and to see what it needs, what it takes for Europe really to move forward in its quest to become autonomous, more sovereign in a sector which will also, of course, be vital for preserving Europe's competitiveness. Something I think which has been discussed in many different from many different angles, but which is still, of course, an unresolved question. So with that, I would like to thank in particular also the Executive Director of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies, Mario Holzner, who has kindly agreed to chair what is a very interesting panel of experts from different parts of Europe. And I'm sure that we are all looking forward to a very interesting discussion this morning. With that, thank you once again, and over to you, Mario.
Thank you very much. I would like to say a big thank you to our hosts from the Centre Franco-Autrichien pour le Rapprochement en Europe, particularly Secretary General Ambassador Schweißgut and his colleagues, Florent Makiak and Katharina Siegwald, also a colleague from our side, Mike Hein, who made this webinar possible, among others. Let us just go all the way to me introducing our great panelists in alphabetical order. Lloyd Campbell, Research Fellow at the Center for Climate and Foreign Policy, German Council on Foreign Relations from Berlin. Antonia Kolibashanu she's Associate Professor at the National University of Political Studies and Public Administration in Bucharest, and visiting researcher at the Centre de Recherche Politique des Sciences Po in Paris. We have Diana Paula Gerasim, Research Fellow and Head of European Energy and Climate Policies at the French Institute for International Relations in Paris. And last but not least, Agata Woskot-Strachota, coordinator of the Energy in Europe project at the Center for Eastern Studies in Warsaw. So we have a great panel of experts in this field, and I would basically like to ask them to give us some 7-minute introduction to their view on the many topics that Ambassador Schweißgut set the stage with, and then we would have another round of maybe 3 or 4 minutes of reactions to the panelists, and then I would suggest we go into a Q&A session where I already ask everyone who is online, and I can see we have 130 persons who are here with us today, so this is really a top webinar. Give us your opinions, use the chat function to introduce questions, comments, and we can then try to deal with that. So I would suggest we just go on in alphabetical order, if this is fine for you. Loyal, would you like to start?
My pleasure. Thank you very much as well to both the institutes for organizing this. I'm very happy to be involved, and thank you as well for the invitation and for organizing all of this. I think this is a very relevant topic. I think I'm just coming back from an Indo-Pacific strategy forum in Ottawa. So I think the most important thing that I would mention is the strategic dependence on China is something that is critically understated. And I think the important thing to do this is basically to look at Russian gas as essentially being an asymmetrical dependency that was structured via long-term policy. And I think the reason why there's important to draw a comparable is because China has been developing this rare earth dependency for several decades. There's a really good report from the U.S. China Security or Exchange Commission that was reported to Congress in 2005, where they did an in-depth investigation, basically trying to see how China had established a dominance in the rare earth space. And in there's a great quote on page 101 where it says in 1992, Deng Xiaoping basically said, there is oil in the Middle East and there's rare earth in China. And I mean, this quote has been said in different reports and different books since, but it's interesting because this kind of frames the strategic thinking for how rare earths are positioned. And there's been other academic papers basically showing different policy developments, whether this be investing in fundamental research in the material labs and material sciences, or structuring a different series of policy instruments to incentivize exports, incentivize production, and incentivize consolidation of rare earths, dating all the way back to 1975. And the interesting thing about this is that you can see that the fundamental dynamics of rare earths are, 50 plus years in the making. So I think that this is a really, really important thing to understand about the long depth of strategic thinking in this space. Whether it was never clear whether this would be relevant to European energy security or whatnot, because the Chinese realized that they had an incredibly good resource in terms of quality of deposits, and that this was really something that could give them significant geopolitical power in some way, shape, or form. This never was directly intended to impact the energy sector, but it's one of those things where you can compare this to Russian gas, where they realize the strategic value of a resource and have a series of policies to structure and consolidate global monopoly. And why is this important? Because I think it frames the length and depth of how long it took them to establish this, which kind of gives the gravity of how long it would take to shift away to actually, increase critical mineral production and increase expanding the supply chain. Because if it took them 50 years to establish the level of control and and basically consolidation across the supply chain, gives us an idea of what that any solution here will take several years, if not decades, in terms of timeline, whether this be finding new mines, building new partnerships, scaling up recycling or reprocessing capacity within Europe or with different partners. And it also shows in general the importance of their strategic thinking, because one of the serious problems within the German context historically has been the lack of appreciation for the intentionality behind China's strategic posturing, where there's generally an appreciation that China is an economic player, but it doesn't necessarily have intentions to structure asymmetrical dependency, which is something that I think is being increasingly doubted upon. And why this is particularly relevant in the case of critical raw materials is because there was a report from the IEA released last year basically showing that critical mineral dependency from one of their, in comparison to their recent report in 2020, actually illustrates that despite all of our strategic posturing, all of our policies, and all of these broad efforts to try and friend shore, near shore, reshore, ally shore, our dependency across most critical minerals has actually increased in several years. And that's kind of a demonstration showing that even though despite the supply chain crunch we had during COVID and all of these challenges and the invasion of Ukraine and this pivot and Zeitenwende and energy policy, everything that we've done strategically since 2020 has really not made any significant inroads. If anything, we're more dependent now on critical minerals across several mineral types than we were in 2020, which I think is indicative of, one, the momentum as well that China has in further compounding this, because they're scaling up production and deployment of renewable technologies. And it also shows that even though we have these strategic policies and we're building these partnerships with different countries, it's still not necessarily making any significant development in a meaningful way that's actually producing and reducing our dependency. And I think this kind of connects to the natural gas conversation in a meaningful way, because it shows that you really, really need to have a long-term strategy and a lot of partners involved in this. And this is where I think the energy deal from the summer really shows the urgency to also kind of pivot away in a more significant sense, because if you have the United States being this major provider of security, kind of obliging or coercing, depending on whichever term you want to use, to extract economic concessions from the European Union, I think that this ends up showing that we need to diversify quite rapidly, because then we're putting all of our security, energy, and economic ties through Washington. That really just weakens us to every significant degree. In the Canadian context, I think this was interesting because they're facing a similar crunch. because their trade negotiations are still ongoing to renegotiate the USMCA, and their security conditions are also being challenged in a similar way. And as far as I'm aware, this is an example of a country that can be partnered with in the European context, because the countries like Canada or Australia have significant critical raw material reserves, and they're both also trying to diversify economic and security relations away from the United States. This doesn't necessarily mean that they stop being partners with the United States. It just means that there's been a fundamental undermining of the transatlantic relationship or the NATO relationship that was never really expected and or appreciated in its true potential. And other than that, I think that this also demonstrates that the importance of investing in political and social economic stability. And this goes back to the Chinese problem, because our major German industries are challenged in a way that they never really expected to be. When China was exporting just like not entirely high value added goods, it wasn't necessarily a problem, because major industrial exports from a country like Germany weren't really challenged in a serious way. But if you look at, for example, the automotive industry, there's a really interesting example where German automotive companies are losing market share within the Chinese market at unprecedented rates, and they're continuing to invest tens of billions of euros into the Chinese market to try and reclaim that share. And as they increase this investment, it furthers the political exposure to Chinese political manipulations at the EU level. And in third markets, you end up having a serious problem as well, because then the competitiveness of industrial exports and manufacturing exports kind of start to erode over time, especially as China moves up the value chain and scales up exports. And this directly connects to the social political stability, because if we don't actually have a valid economic or transition model that is based off of exporting green tech or even deploying our own green tech within Europe, we lose a lot of that credibility of the green transition. And as far as I'm concerned, the European Union is one of the main economic blocs that has really pushed really hard to try and have a solid, coherent political validity of an economic transition around green tech. And without this, we end up having a risk of a serious further rise within the far right. And I think that might be over 7 minutes now, so I do apologize, but those are generally my points.
Thanks a lot well, I mean, Antonia, Loyal painted a fairly gloomy picture. Can you top that, or what's your take?
I'm not sure if I can be more optimistic, but I will do my best. I will take the bridge that Loyal has started to basically discuss a bit about natural gas and our dependency as we understand autonomy related to defense and energy. So basically, we are at the moment where we realize that we have military capabilities tied into energy dependency, and we are still very much dependent on the U.S. when it comes to defense, and that means that we are very much dependent on what's going on in domestic policies within the U.S., and that is very much true. So I will repeat a bit what Loyal said about the dependency that is building up between the U.S. and the EU with the recent trade agreement. We are currently basically importing about half of our needs of LNG from the U.S. The rest comes from Norway, Mid East, and some North African supplies, but those are basically tied to another kind of instability. So except for Norway, we have the Gulf instability that is basically defining the market of energy. And given that, we have the green agenda, and we have profiled ourselves in the EU as a geopolitical actor, also through that green agenda and standardization. The key problem that I think we're seeing right now is how do we keep the green agenda and support reindustrialization so that we actually invest in deterrence and potential defense capabilities, right? And with that in mind, I think that I'm going to highlight several problems that we have in terms of policy. So as a geopolitical analyst, I'm looking at the kind of constraints that I see in the European Union policy planning, strategic policy planning to balance the two. First, I do not think that we have a clear understanding of autonomy tied to EU sovereignty, if you want, in terms of deterrence and defense capabilities, but also in terms of energy dependencies and autonomy. So I think that we should think about defining what autonomy means, looking at the functional elements and staying as far away as we can from the national terms and, let's say, definitions that may get us into a trap of especially those social problems that Loyal pointed out at the end of his speech, with far right coming and basically portraying some of the issues as needed to be solved by the member states themselves and not necessarily at the EU level. In the functional definition of autonomy, I see basically the core element being going with the capabilities that the EU and each state has to focus in balancing resources, but in also building critical nodes that could mean anything from storage capabilities, but also infrastructure, so ports, LNG terminals, interconnectors that we have started building, but obviously we still are a long way to go. At the same time, I think autonomy should take into account how we manage dependence. And I use the word managed external, the word managed in conjunction with external dependence, because I do not think that we will be able to be fully independent in the EU. So yes, we do have the ability to support some projects. So we currently, I'm coming from Romania, and therefore I'm very much watching what's going on in the Black Sea with Neptune Deep, which is a major project that could pump in natural gas that will probably be able to secure some of the industrialization capabilities that are coming next, but also some of the consumption that Southern and Eastern Europe currently has, and replace basically Russia from being a supplier to some countries here, which is raising a major question mark. Will Russia allow this? And we have the agreement discussions and the so-called 28-point plan that are, well, there are points that are pretty much disturbing for the EU and the Europeans in general, and they should be, because we are not discussing them. We are basically taking them and discussing the points among ourselves. And again, dependencies between the US and between Russia. So that raises the question, what will Russia do even if there is a peacekeeping agreement or a truce or a peace plan with regards to projects in the Black Sea? And that refers not only Romanian projects, but also Bulgarian projects, potential projects, and Turkish potential projects, because the Black Sea has reserves. So in this sense, I believe that we should look at autonomy also in terms of, okay, managing external dependence and managing diversification while building infrastructure and making sure that we put the money where our mouth is, so to say, in terms of building the infrastructure that is critical for the short and medium term first, and then go to long term. And we cannot afford to dream of long-term projects, I think, without settling on the short and medium term, particularly because of the social pressure that we are seeing internally, and also the balancing act. We are in the middle, and we have to be basically aware of that also when we are planning. The second point that I have with regards to strategic principles that we should basically consider when defining autonomy: integrated planning. So basically, look at what kind of fuel needs we have for reindustrialization, and consider the defense sector demand, while also making the energy security assessments as part of our social resilience planning. So until now, we didn't really consider defense as a key element. Now we are seeing that as an opportunity, but as we are seeing it as an opportunity, if we do not consider it as a European Union opportunity, and we keep focusing on the member states' opportunities, we are going to support fragmentation. And that is a big risk that we see, because that is not going to allow us to have European deterrence. On the contrary. At the same time, I think that, we have all these debates about what is green and what is not green, and the nuclear discussion, and how the nuclear resource is going to help us build resilience, I think is very important to be taken at the very same level that we discussed the planning, and in the very same strategic framework that we'll look at defense capabilities. Because obviously, and I'm not an expert here, I'm only reading and basically asking the main questions on this matter. I believe that we are at a point where the balancing between the US and Russia is also referring to negotiating the big questions of defense capabilities, and nuclear is going to be part of that at the consumption level, resilience, electricity consumption level, but also in terms of small modular reactors, building defense capabilities for the future. And that's an important element to tackle within the European Union. We have countries that are champions. We have France that is a champion in this regard, but we also have to have an understanding within the EU and build that autonomy strategic planning to integrate this. And to not go beyond the time, I will only say that I think we need to also think about the question of building protection. And this refers also to the international relations domain. So external deterrence, defense, and the question of how do we build a secured Europe internationally, but also how do we give the feeling that we offer protection for our own industries and our own population internally. And this is, again, I'm not a specialist in strategic communication. I'm not a specialist in how to build resilience internally. But the main element that I see related to energy security is the assessment of critical infrastructure and the protection standards that we have for critical infrastructure that need to be also communicated to the public. What do I mean by that? Strategic pipelines, nuclear plants, major storage capabilities, subsea cables. These need to be known also by our public, the citizens, the individuals, as key energy infrastructure that we protect, that we take care of. And that is a responsibility element that we have in Europe, that we are taking, and we have taken it, but that we are keeping as dual use capability that refers directly to our deterrence capabilities as Europe, and that we are integrating into the resilience framework for the society. And if we don't do this in terms of strategic communication, even if we would implement the planning and the redefinition of strategic autonomy, I think we are going to lose the game for the instability that is coming up because of the socioeconomic problems that our societies in the member states are facing, and the potential for far right, and not only far right, I will say populism in general, is going to grow. And that's not going to bring logic, strategic planning. That's going to bring a lot of fighting, which is not what we want in Europe. And I think that's a key element to tackle, that we can actually tackle if we have a good approach. We, in terms of policymakers, not me, who is asking the problem. So I'm sorry if I'm also pessimistic in the sense of asking questions and pointing the problems, but I think questions might be important.
Absolutely. No. You also, I mean, you also gave some, you hinted at some approaches how to tackle the issue. You mentioned nuclear, so it's natural to move on to Paris. Diana Paula, what's your take on these issues?
Thank you, Mario. And I won't start by nuclear energy, but maybe if needed in the questions, we can also discuss about this. No, maybe I will bring a positive note actually to to the discussion, which is incredibly coming from a French perspective. But I would say that actually we have been so brutalized, at least since 2022, that today talking about strategic autonomy is no longer a French specificity, but a European necessity. And I think this is a good thing, that we have reached this degree where we commonly acknowledge that we need strategic autonomy. And maybe just to a bit nuance what Antonia was saying on the fact that we don't have an understanding of autonomy, I would be maybe a bit positive on this, but saying that I think we have started to reflect on this. We have a definition for strategic autonomy in terms of making sure that we can take our decisions and not be able to bear the consequences, and not be pressured into taking some decisions. So there is a sort of understanding of this. There are also some first, let's say, benchmarks of how we understand it. For instance, on critical raw materials, if you look at the Critical Raw Materials Act, we have this benchmark of we cannot have a dependency of more than 65% on a material on one single supplier. So this can be considered of a start of reflection and action on strategic autonomy. And then I would also remind that we have we started to have measures of economic security. We have for the first time a strategy on economic security that, if I'm not mistaken, will be revised. There are some first measures we have seen with steel, with cars, of course, far from enough. We still lack a complete strategy on protecting our market, but there are some moves in this direction. And I think that going forward, the context is so sharply deteriorating. As far as we can see from here, we don't see things improving. And I think there are three main threats that will continue to push Europe towards strategic autonomy. The first one has already been mentioned, is Russia, of course, the security threat, the need to rethink the security framework in Europe, to take more responsibility for our defense. This implies an increase in spending, so we go towards 5% of GDP, which, as Antonia has mentioned, actually could become an issue in terms of, also fueling populism, because a lot of people don't really understand. There are governments, I will not say who, but have been openly saying on the TV, on the public TV, that we will take money from health and education and give it to the defense. So this is very, very, is not well received by the citizens. So, but from an energy point of view, there is also a threat that we will not put as much money as we should put on the energy transition and put more on defense. So I think we have to be very smart on that and make sure that there are synergies between defense and energy transition, knowing that you cannot actually pretend to have strategic autonomy in Europe if you do not have energy security. And energy security on a continent that is poor on fossil fuels can only go through the energy transition. We currently have a 55% or more dependence on energy imports. These are like 95% fossil fuels. We have seen the enormous cost that this has put on the European economy in 2022. So we cannot afford to go through this again. We need this energy transition to happen, and we need money to be invested in it. It's not security or energy, it's both of them. The second big threat is China. It has been mentioned. It's a commercial threat. It's the question of overcapacities in China, but it's also, their willingness, their political willingness actually to devaluate their currency to promote their exports. And we have seen the issue of exports, of course, in the solar sector, in the batteries, EVs, but now increasingly so in the wind sector. This is a sector where Europe used to be very strong. And we are still like 90% of our deals are using European manufacturers, but increasingly you see companies like Mingyang coming to Europe, in Italy, in Germany, in Scotland, and trying to deploy projects, to deploy manufacturing facilities as well, and they have the backing of the Chinese government, the Chinese supply chain. So. And this also brings another question of how the US will pressure us on this issue. We have seen a first reaction from the US related to the Mingyang project in Scotland, saying that this is a national security issue. They are not very happy about it. So we have seen the German government canceling the Luxcara deal with Mingyang on turbines. So I think there will be more to see on this sector in these supply chains. And I will go back to the critical raw materials issue that Loel was talking about. This is a huge issue we have in terms of dependence. Is mostly dependence on the refining part towards China. And I would say that it's not that our measures are not working, is that we are actually not ready to pay the price for resilience. I mean, you can't just take measures, legislative measures, and expect that the whole market will follow you. You have to put money in these projects. And we are not putting that money because simply we don't have money that are allocated to critical raw materials so far at European level. So we need that money. We need that special funding because it's really a European question. And then I will mention the third threat issue that we have. It's with the US. Is probably the most unexpected one. Is the regulatory tension that we have with the US. We have seen it on the methane regulation, CSRD, CSDD. It will continue on the digital, on the agricultural standards. And this is very hard actually to manage. Of course, there is also the agreement from this summer, which is very hard to understand what will imply for how it will be actually put in practice, because the Commission has absolutely no power to force companies to buy gas, but at the same time, we have these objectives of diversification. Will we continue to have them or not? So. If bottom line, if I come to what I would like to see in terms of going forward on strategic autonomy, I would say that first of all, on the energy security framework that is supposed to come out at the beginning of next year, I think we should have We should maintain the objectives of diversification of our supplies. Despite US pressures, I think we should account for the issue of cyber attacks and physical attacks on our critical infrastructure. I think we should also make it clear that energy transition is a pillar of our energy security. So in this sense, have measures that help with better integration of renewables, with bringing more flexibility to the system and deploying grids. And then on the resilience of value chains part, I think we really need to accept, and when I say we, it's not only member states and public authorities, I think it's also industries, so OEMs in the case of batteries and cars, we need to accept to pay the price of resilience. Otherwise, we will always end up in the situations that we ended up this year with the rare earths question. So we need risk sharing tools, we need collaboration between public and private sector. There is no one tool that will do a miracle. We need equity investments, guarantees, price floors, a combination of them. We also need to think very strategically about what is already in Europe, and that is the black mass from batteries. And today we have done a study on this. 80% of the black mass is going to South Korea. So we need to be able to maintain this black mass in Europe, to refine it here, and also to build the rest of the supply chain, because someone needs to consume it. So we need the PCAM, the CAM. This is strategic thinking and long-term thinking. And of course, we get to the made in Europe criteria. Absolutely important to be able to have a preference for European producers that respect our standards, that are producing with low carbon energy, that are doing the modernization and transformations necessary to ensure our resilience and our energy transition. I think that would be for me. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Arguably, Poland was the first member states of the Union that really, I think, understood that investment in infrastructure and defense is crucial. Agata, what's the view from Warsaw?
Hi, Mario. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. And it's always difficult to take floor as the last person, so probably I will be somehow relating or repeating some earlier comments, but then let me come back to energy and dependencies here. And you asked for, well, I would give you 3 points here and try to develop each of them. So first of all, when it comes to energy, what we see in recent years is moving away from importing energy, both oil and gas, from Russia. We are almost there. But it does not really mean a reduction in EU's import dependency on third countries per se, but rather a change in its shape and nature. And we've already heard a little bit about that we have more LNG from the US, which in the first half of 2025 was only second supplier after Norway. LNG means greater diversification. Still, we have some few key suppliers. But LNG especially shows that we have much less imports via pipelines, especially onshore ones, and more via tankers, oil or LNG, and offshore links, which means increased dependencies on seas. In terms of EU energy security, including what we heard from Antonia, dependence on trade routes and critical infrastructure. In Poland, we focus on Baltic Sea. In Romania, you focus on Black Sea, but there is also North Sea, there is Mediterranean, and there we have bottlenecks such as Danish Straits, and for oil markets such as Hormuz Strait or Suez Canal. And then we also see the change in contractual terms, especially in gas. We see less of long-term contracts and more of spot trade and short terms. That means EU is more closely tied to global markets and its dynamics, and it has positive and negative implications, of course. So on the one hand, we have more options for diversification in case of a need, or for flexible responses. On the same time, we are very tied to this volatility of global market, and we see that, for example, in our price movements. Second point is that EU's growing dependence, especially on LNG, but also other commodities or technologies from the US, is both a benefit, an opportunity, and a challenge. And we also heard about that. So we see diversifying away and moving away from Russian fuels, which is enabled to a big extent by also imports from the US. It also somehow cements our European-American ties, but on the other hand, what we heard, we see unpredictability and political shifts by current administration, pressures and uncertainty. What's worth remembering, in my opinion, is that this gas dependence on the US still does not reach, and will likely not reach, the scale and depth of dependence on Russian gas. Also because of the nature that I told, offshore, onshore pipelines versus LNG market specifics, contract types, and that they are being honored, at least for now, by US companies. There are no clear signals that they would like to stop to. And also because execution of these contracts actually supports current administration strategic goal, which is increased exports of fossil fuels, named as energy dominance. At the same time, I would like to stress that even going beyond the nature of this current US administration, there is growing gap between EU's approach as importer dependent on external suppliers, and US approach, which has become a net exporter and is seeking by nature of exporters' behavior to extract trends from that position. So US is behaving more and more like other exporters of fossil fuels do. And this gap is growing, and it inevitably means different perspective, goals and definitions. For example, of energy security, EU's approach will focus mostly on security of supply, stable and affordable deliveries, whereas US is increasingly, not solely, but increasingly focused on security of demand and profit maximization. And then third point is about China to some extent. So energy transition, which is continuing in parallel with geopolitical challenges, or even it accelerated after energy crisis, enables gradual reduction of dependence on fossil fuels, but at the same time, it creates new dependencies. And we heard a lot about that already today. What is important is to remember that as long as the transition is not completed, and so as long as it continues, there are two energy systems in Europe which coexist there, one based on fossil fuels and one based on clean energy. And so we have also these two different dependencies coexisting. So dependencies on clean energy did not fully replace dependence on fossil fuels as for now. And this is also a challenge per se, as it increases the range of risks, even if it reduces the weight of some of them. It's also worth remembering that there are significant differences between these two types of dependencies. So dependency on fossil fuels is dependency on flows, as you probably all know, which means that any disruption on major supply route is quite difficult and has relatively rapid consequences. Dependence on clean tech or critical raw materials means dependence on stocks. What we have bought and what we have installed in Europe works for us, and it is also much more possible to build up stocks. And we heard a lot about China already. So indeed, Chinese know-how, scale of production, ability to decrease prices due to scale of production and other factors but also concentration of deposits or facilities to transform raw materials means that there is growing dependence of the EU on Chinese supplies in several areas crucial for European energy transition, and it has several consequences. One of them is that the scale and the prices which we see in China limit the development of European clean tech sector. Second is risk of instrumentalization that we saw, which means possibility of price increases, but also constraint availability. And the last one is security challenge, which is related to possibility of electronic, control of electronic devices in parts of clean tech, which we see in case of inverters, solar panels, etc. And shall I also address right now what I see, what we should focus on as European Union, or we should go to this?
Maybe we put that in the last round before the Q&A.
Yes, okay. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. It's difficult to summarize all the points that were made, but I would say that Leyen was focusing on this long-term strategic issues, inter alia, obviously, mentioning also not only energy, but materials in general that are critical with regard also to what China's long-term strategies were. Antonia was focusing on, among other things, on short-term issues, particularly in Europe related to infrastructure. Diana Paula was also dealing with this whole issue of the political economy of the developments that we are seeing. And I think Agatha was refocusing everything on energy issues and taking in the perspective of the US and China and how all of this relates to the European Union. Let me maybe bring it back a little bit to what Dietmar mentioned in the beginning and about Mario Draghi's report. And basically, as we know, after 1 year, hardly anything really happened in that respect. I think there is a little bit of a discussion about some, in my opinion, rather peripheral issues of the Draghi report, which are being quoted a lot, but I think central elements of the Draghi report are not actually being discussed in the public. And there was I think we can learn a lot from history, and there was recently a paper published in Clio Dynamics, which looked at states or state systems and societies and how they dealt with huge fundamental crises. And they looked particularly at systems that actually managed to overcome those crises. And they identified, looking from the Roman Republic all the way to interwar US, 3 elements. One, and probably most important one, the elites being willing to sacrifice. 2, deep institutional fundamental reform of the system. And 3, an increase in state capacity in order to sustain those reforms for a long period of time. And I think this is also the way how one could think of central elements of the Draghi report, because actually my interpretation of his report, and there is a very useful summary of, unfortunately, the report is so huge that nobody really read it. And I think there's a very useful summary Draghi gave in December last year, a speech in Paris, and CPR was actually publishing a policy brief with that speech. So it's on a few pages, one can really read what is important for Draghi himself. And the basic idea is to pump in hundreds and hundreds of billions of euros, if not trillions, into the energy transition, but in particular. in order basically to run hot the European economy and make private investment in high tech much more likely via this massive increase of demand. And he suggests basically to introduce also a financing scheme basically via Eurobonds. And basically, once you introduce Eurobonds, you need to refinance basically pay the interest rates on those bonds at some point in time, which obviously means that we need European taxes, typically in the area where the nation state has the biggest problems to tax, namely the corporates, the capital element. So I think this is, I think, a good parallel to those historical cases of where systems in crisis were able to save themselves. And basically, I think it won't work without increasing taxation, and those who actually have anyway opted out to pay by and large taxes. And if we want to save the system, I think we really need to develop this European state capacity, so to speak, which is then able to massively invest in, for instance, the energy infrastructure, in everything that is related also to the rare earth materials and everything that was mentioned so far in the discussion. Dietmar, do you want to chip in also with a comment on what was said so far?
Yes, maybe just a brief comment. On China, I happened to have been in China 3 weeks ago for a short conference, and one of the things I came away with was that I think European hopes that one would be able to enter into sort of a constructive dialogue with China on sort of focusing also on European needs, on dealing with overcapacity issues, in trying to stem what the Chinese have been pursuing for a long time, namely increasing their strategic autonomy to a degree where they would be no longer dependent, ideally, on anybody else, while making everybody else more dependent on themselves. I think that dialogue is at the moment leading nowhere. So I think one of the comments which was made in the discussion, namely European preference that we need to think about protection, is essential. And at the same time, I think what you were saying, Mario, that when we really want to achieve our goals, it will require, as was said, integrated planning. It will require sort of a serious strategic commonality of views among member states, but it will also require huge investments. So basically what we are talking about is that we seem to have all the elements. We don't seem to have everything in place. There were different views on how far we have managed basically to move along the trajectory of the green transition and energy autonomy. But at the same time, I think what is really lacking is sort of this huge effort and preparing also our populations and explaining more properly why this requires joint action at such a huge level. I think that is something I would like to bring into the discussion.
Thanks a lot. We have still the same number of participants in the webinar as at the beginning of the webinar. So I think people like what happened so far and are very interested, and would definitely want to also chip in the Q&A session. But let me first give the chance to all of our distinguished panelists to, so to speak, wrap up, comment on what happened so far, and give their two or three main policy recommendations how to get out of this crisis. So let's start again with Lloyd.
Yeah, thank you very much. I three policy recommendations. I'm not really sure if I, if I have as many answers to the questions because I think we still have these problems. But I think one point that I wanted to add was an additional point that was raised to my attention a few days ago, basically highlighting that even in recent weeks, Russia has actually started to try and realize the severe dependencies on China's rare earths as well. I think there was an announcement by Mr. Sergei Shoigu, basically talking about 700 billion rubles being invested into Siberian rare earth processing centers. And I think the interesting thing here, and this was from a Chinese media source that was talking about this, and the interesting thing here is you can even see that there is a global recognition to reduce dependencies on China, whether this be from some of its most highly relevant military and strategic partners like Russia or otherwise. And I think in this case, one of my recommendations is that there is a global appetite to reduce dependence on China, not just from Europe, not just from the West, not just from NATO allies. There's also interest generally from countries like South Africa, Brazil, Chile, and otherwise to try and reduce dependency on this. And I do think that there is a lot of space for the European Union, Germany, France, Austria, other countries to really try and get a global momentum behind this. To what extent this will be successful remains to be seen, but I do think that this is framing an opportunity, because if the situation is so austere that even Russia is recognizing that it's important to build strategic capacity here, I think it's a good indicator that there are a lot of countries that are moving in this direction. Not that we need to work with Russia, but I think that it's important to highlight basically the severity of the strategic vulnerability that this represents. In another capacity, I do think it's important to recognize the opportunity to create more space for middle powers in the European context. I think countries like Germany are really recognizing that the strain of the breaking of the transatlantic security relations creates other opportunities, especially in an era defined by disruption from the White House. I think there are a lot of countries, Canada and Australia are the two primary examples, but even Japan and South Korea or otherwise that are facing severe disruption in their space, and they can definitely be tied into expanding deeper industrial cooperation with the European Union. And I think this does represent a significant opportunity. I mean, especially if you're talking about things like defense industrial capacity. Like, I mean, a country like South Korea has capacity that the EU might not have. And I mean, this could also extend in things like nuclear technologies or renewable technologies, because if we partner with these other countries, then we can get more resources and as well more bang for a buck, because some companies are very, very leading. For example, could be Panasonic for the only battery tech that really exists outside of China come from South Korea and Japan. So I think in this case, then it's a good example where we could scale up our EV deployment by partnering with them. But those would be basically my two main recommendations and the other additional points that I wanted to comment on.
Thanks a lot, Antonia.
Thank you. And well, policy recommendations, I will reframe them into sort of priorities, because policy recommendations right now, as I pointed out in my previous speech, are short-term, medium-term, and yes, we do have the strategy paperwork. We just need to think about how to put it in practice, and that is the number one priority, I would say. I don't know if that's a policy, so I would point out that, okay, planning for putting into practice what we have into the paperwork is number one. Then I think number two should be implementing the Critical Raw Materials Act as an industrial strategy and not necessarily as a checklist as it is now. So that means that integrating what we want into the paper and at the political level with the needs that are urgent and the long-term objectives. And I know that this sounds very academic, but I think that, in terms of communication, there is a need for the public to understand why we are focused on the Critical Minerals Act. How is that going to help countries that are not necessarily Germany? And how is that going to bring forward deterrence and defense? Because as we know, we have different kind of problems. So Italy has a different problem than, I don't know, Hungary or Poland, for instance. We need to make that convergence in reality and to transform that paperwork into a sort of a, this is the goal, this is why we're doing this. Then I would say that it would, number 3 is basically look at how we can work with the US while managing the interoperability of the transatlantic partnership. Because it is pretty clear that we cannot detach. That's a partner. Most of the EU countries are in NATO. NATO is still our umbrella. The US is still very much the provider for security if a war is going to start tomorrow. And that's a hard fact that we cannot ignore. However, the policy changing and what Agata pointed out, the different perspectives that are coming from the structural problems that the US is dealing with is something that Europe needs to address as well and see where we can build bridges and how we manage that relationship. And the last point, I would say that we need to think about how to build a clustered industrial strategy. So I know that in the strategy document, we do have that, we envision the European Union resilience and everything, but we still have national vanity projects that are very much, their own. I'm not going to point fingers, but right now we are at the point where we look at the borders. And especially the eastern border, Poland and Romania know very well what the eastern danger means. We also have the southern border challenged, and it seems that in every sea we have projects that may help us, but also challenges that will come forth. So in integrating a clustered industrial strategy and saying, okay, why do we need, gas from Cyprus? Should we even consider, how are we going to consider that into the larger network? So I'm making stuff up on purpose just to basically address the fragmentation point that we need to overcome, because we have them and we need to be realistic about them. And especially now that we're talking about autonomy. And that's it for me. Again, sorry if I'm overly pessimistic pointing out the problems, but
right.
Yeah.
That's our job. Thanks a lot. Diana, Paula, please join us here.
Yeah, I've already mentioned a couple of my policy recommendations at the end of my first intervention, but maybe just to build up on what was said on the communication part with the population, I think that's absolutely essential. And if we talk about, Antonia mentioned the strategic infrastructures, I think we should also focus in the energy transition on better communicating what is in there for the citizens, like in terms of jobs, competitiveness, local value added, like renewable energies pay more local taxes, and that helps communities. Also in terms of savings, what we save in terms of money from not importing fossil fuels, and also finally, like building new skills, because this is such an undervalued issue at European level. And nevertheless, when you look at studies from the EIB, from the OECD, you see that skills is the first issue for the competitiveness in Europe. Like, all the companies complain for not having the right skills. So we need to help people acquire the right skills, the skills we need in industries, and especially I would say in those regions, coal regions, but also more widely regions that have been affected by the industrialization, and make this energy transition the reindustrialization opportunity of our generation. I know this is not easy, but I also, talking to industries, I also know that there is a willingness to do so. We just need probably more public support for this, and there are a lot of money available for it. There's the Just Transition Fund, the Modernization Fund, the European Social Fund, so many funds that could be used in this sense. I have already discussed about the resilience of value chains. Just to insist, so that would be my second part, to insist on the need to put money behind our ambitions, targets. It won't happen with only the Critical Raw Materials Act. We need to have funding for these projects. We need to de-risk them. So that could be the EIB, that could be money from the next MFF, but that comes a bit too late. So we need to find that tools, and we need to stop the black mass leakage in Europe. And that should be done really, really soon. And maybe a third one, which I have not mentioned, is it's quite a down to earth one, but pushing the electricity demand. Today in Europe, you have 75% almost of low carbon electricity in the European system, but only 23% of electrification. So we need this electricity demand to go up. That will encourage further development of renewables, of nuclear energy. We have this issue in France. Now the discussion is whether we will have enough electricity consumption for all the nuclear capacity that we want to add to the system. And there is the debate, nuclear against renewables is coming back. So we really need to solve this issue, because that will bring much more resilience to the system, consuming more electricity produced in Europe with predictable prices. And of course, we need to work on the bill, because it is an issue for people. The fact that electricity costs more than gas today, it's an issue. We need to fix the taxes in the electricity bills, reduce them, support also flexibility. So that means battery storage, that means demand side response. These are tools that we absolutely need to put in place. And of course, I will not even mention, it has been so much discussed, the permitting issue. In Europe, we have adopted 2 legislations at least on this, the legislation from 2023, from 2022 energy crisis, and the RED III. And still this has not been translated at the national level. We still have issues like with permitting taking too much time for low carbon energy, for industrial installations. It's not possible to make progress in this way. So we need a lot of political willingness from member states to make progress, to advance in the right direction. I'll stop here.
Excellent, thanks. Agatha.
Thank you. So, agreeing with most of what previous panels said, indeed we need more money, and to put money where our mouth is. At the same time, we don't have money is not unlimited. So what we need is prioritization and hierarchy of goals, and some coherence among them. So when it comes to energy and climate policy, it's really actually a broad thing, because it's as much about energy climate and energy transition, as about defense right now, as about foreign relations, social cohesion and affordability, industrial competitiveness, etc., etc. And it's really worthwhile designing energy policy to focus what is our priority goal, what is short-term and long-term goal. Antonia was also referring to this short-term and long-term perspective. For sure, we should not put more attention into long-term goals than into short-term challenges and needs. And when it comes to three priorities that I would see, one is focus on security. And here I told already about maritime security. We as Europe rely on seas to a big extent when it comes to meeting our energy needs on different levels. And so it's about security of onshore, offshore infrastructure, but also of specific devices in our renewable installations, solar, wind turbines, but also it means diversification. And again, on every level of carriers, energy carriers, I mean, infrastructure, international partnership, contracts, etc., etc. And in order to enhance that security, we need to focus, and this is the second point, on own capacities. And you, Mario, mentioned that, because again, this is a very wide category. So we need to develop best policies to increase own capacities on many levels, be it production of energy, critical minerals, access to them in Europe or beyond Europe, clean tech, and political capacities and engagement abroad. Here, somehow we should also, as Loyola mentioned, partner with our allies and like-minded. And I see specifically Japan and South Korea, as you told already, important here because actually they experience earlier than us consequences of deep dependence on China and have actually developed some measures and policy to limit that vulnerability. And last but not least is pragmatism. In our international relations in energy, but also in our internal energy and climate policies and wider. I would say that this point focuses also on affordability and competitiveness, but also again about weighing this short-term versus long-term focus of our policies. Yes, and I would stop here.
Thank you very much. I would maybe just allow me to make it more precise. What are the limits of money? I would argue that the limits of money are where the physical limits of our capabilities are. As long as we can do it in the real world, as long as we have enough hours of work, the skills, the physical materials to do, we can basically do whatever we really want. It's a matter just of political will, and the money is being made out of the thin air via the banking system. So I think there is a long way to go until we reach the limits of money, so to speak, as a matter of just prioritizing investments. I think that was the key word of all the interventions of our panelists today. It's about investment, investment, investment. Maybe the motto of the European Union needs to be changed in something like just do it, or something similar like that. The pragmatism that needs to be involved in all of this. I like this phrase also very much. And I think all panelists also mentioned that we are not alone on this planet, that there are others who have similar problems, and that basically we need to cooperate with those others. On a positive note, the Commission has started a string of trade negotiations with a lot of partners. I think that's a positive sign, and I think also quite remarkable that if you look who is the biggest supporter of the Mercosur treaty, it's actually President Lula. And I think Brazil has very important incentives to also find friends among those remaining democracies on this planet. And we should, I think, do also much more, not only from an economic, but actually also from a political angle to connect to all the remaining democracies and try to defend our way of life in this respect. And if I may just add another point, which we haven't really touched upon, but which I think is also in this respect quite important. Europe's strategy with regard to Africa is, I think, noble. I mean, this global gateway that should have been some kind of a channel through which we would increase our relations with that only really a dynamic continent in the decades to come, where basically the majority of increases of workforce will only come from Africa. There is hardly anything else to be expected in the rest of the world. There are countries with already very strong economic growth, and it is clear that we completely neglected basically our main neighbor across the Mediterranean Sea, and I think this is also something in relation to energy, in relation also to materials. And I mean, let me just quote also recent studies on, for instance, Morocco and the development of an e-battery, e-vehicles production there, and in the options that many countries of that southern neighbor of ours have. Now, let me ask the audience to use the Q&A chat that you have in your Zoom panel. I have already 2 questions. Let me summarize them. One anonymous is claiming that there is simply not enough made in Europe. Clean Tech and Net Zero Industry Act is full of clauses allowing for exemptions, precisely for this reason unlikely to change anytime soon. Anyone wants to jump in on this one? It's maybe more of a comment, but
I can, I don't know. I got,
please,
yeah.
just
No, just to say a word that indeed the Net Zero Industry Act is a start of a sort of European preference, and but it's quite complicated to understand the resilience, sustainability criteria, and all that. And I was discussing this week with someone who is from the regulator side, and they're supposed to implement it. So indeed, it's quite difficult for them as well. They're trying, but it's still not. It just started the implementation. So for now, we don't really see the effects of it. I still think it's a good start because it redirects us away from the price dimension. But I would agree with the comment saying that there is indeed a lot of space for, you know, getting away with it. Like, you know, I think it's if it is if the price increases by 15%, then you are not obliged to take into account this criteria. And it's also only applied to renewable auctions. So we need something much broader that encompasses other clean tech sectors. Of course, we have the battery regulation, but this also has been quite questioned lately. Yeah, we're still at the beginning of it. Although we should go much faster, we see that the implementation, as always with European legislation, is quite challenging, and that member states do not keep the speed. I don't know if it's only a question of political willingness. I think sometimes it's also a question of administrative capacity and being able to prepare those people that do the auctions, that do the permitting, to fully understand what is expected and how they should implement this. So I do hope that the Made in Europe criteria would be a bit easier to digest and to implement in practice. But it's of course also the fruit of a compromise. So you have to get Germany and France to to agree on something that is acceptable for both of them. And we know that despite the fact there is a sort of agreement that we need strategic autonomy, I think in the details there is not probably the same determination to go very as far as one would go on Made in Europe. So yeah, it's still quite challenging.
Thanks. Any of
If
the
I
other
could add to that,
panelists? Yeah, just chip in.
I think an important point from a German perspective is to say that I think being pragmatic in this is also to allow countries to exploit their kind of advantages to the fullest development without being obstructionist. And I think if we go back to the taxonomy discussion about hydrogen colors, I think that this is one place where previous German positions have been more obstructive rather than constructive. And I think in this case, I mean, I working in Germany, I could, be sitting here railing about why nuclear energy is not great or why it's expensive, but I don't think that that's rather productive. So I think in this case, it's a good demonstration of pragmatism when you're just saying, pick your battles and focus on expediting the renewable transition and industrial build out rather than fighting over exactly how to do it. I think that this is where I think we need to be much more forward leaning.
Thanks. Yeah, all the other panelists, just chip in whenever you think you want to add something.
So maybe I think that, the export controls by China may actually help us in a sense that they show that there is the sense of urgency. And actually, when we are in a crisis, we proved as Europe that we can, European countries, that we can act in a concrete and effective way. Look at Germany and LNG developments after February 2022. In Eastern Europe, we felt this urgency in case of Russia much earlier, but I mean, feeling that it's happening now is important. And then the second point is that indeed it will not happen in short term. So in short term, we need this two-pillar approach towards China. So we need very pragmatically, but cooperate with it. And try to shape as much as possible, because I don't think it's very, we have big possibilities here, the rules of the game. I mean, focus on technology transfers, would it be possible or not? But then at the same time, very hardy and in a very concrete terms and seeking a very concrete deliverables, work on diversification and on capacities. And here I completely agree that we need also to somehow review our European policy towards Africa.
Great. I have here Nathan from EDF, who is asking about European dependence on Russian uranium and the Commission preparing a ban to imports. How can these imports be banned without jeopardizing the enhancing of nuclear power, which, as you said, is necessary for our energy security?
So if I may jump also here for as a first speaker, I would say that indeed Europe is dependent on uranium, actually on Russian nuclear fuel supplies in whole cycle, because there are different, let's say, levels of this dependency. At the same time, there are advanced actually works on diversification of nuclear fuel supplies to those reactors which are based on Russian technology. In Europe, we have Westinghouse project, actually nuclear fuel supplies compatible with Russian VVRs have already started to Ukraine as first, but not only to Ukraine. And then there is EDF project implemented. So there is work which is going on. It is a process, not a fait accompli. So we cannot really expect, and this is my understanding, that we cannot really expect this ban to be decided very soon and to become effective in an immediate future. But this is also a case of the US, I would say, because it's also dependent on this high enriched uranium imports from Russia. So I would say this might be one of the areas where we Europeans and US, this even this administration have common goals, and we could look for somehow joint endeavors to diversify our supply chain. One of ideas, but there are many, is beside strengthening partnership with other suppliers such as Canadians, which are our allies, is looking at suppliers which are in more difficult position, and this is Kazakhstan. And here I think that tailored and really thought through EU policy towards Central Asia is important. Kazakhstan is actually biggest producer of uranium, but it's still, its nuclear industry is heavily interlinked with Russia. But I guess there are possibilities on working on that, and I understand that French are doing also some job towards this goal. Thank you.
Thanks. Anyone else? Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe just to mention that when you look at uranium imports to the EU, actually, I wouldn't say we are really dependent on Russia, because if I'm not mistaken, in 2023, we were like 23% of uranium imports from Russia. And that was also because the Central Eastern European countries were probably making some stocks before, transitioning to Westinghouse technologies. So I think this is starting to be managed and should be managed. But of course, and also at the same time, what Agata was mentioning, we have increased our imports from Canada. So I think it's more than 80% increase of uranium from Canada between 2022 and 2023. So these are good signs of diversification. You also see the European Investment Bank that has decided to support an Orano project for uranium enrichment. So 400 million euros given by the EIB, invested by the EIB in this project. I think this is a good sign. I think that it should be pursued. So European involvement in this sector should, of course, increase, because it's a matter of energy security, and also because we see that many countries want to pursue nuclear energy. We see this in Central and Eastern European countries, but also like Sweden, Netherlands, beyond France. I mean, France is not the only country who wants to have nuclear, and I think this should be taken into account. Yes.
Thanks. Agathe is asking, should we introduce rules of origin for materials, and how? Who wants to chip in?
So, a small comment. I understand that right now, kind of rules of origin or are supposed to be introduced when it comes to gas imports. And let's see how it works, because it's already a challenge, I guess. And then the other thing is that challenge when it comes to minerals is that they are not, well, the problem is not only with minerals produced in China. I understand that Chinese companies have stakes all over the world, well, in many places, and they mine critical materials. And I'm not sure how to, define these rules of origin in such a case. I'm not saying it's not worth it, but I think this topic needs more in-depth thinking first, and then deciding on specific measures to introduce. But what it makes me thinking is that energy policy or energy climate policy in this sense, it's more and more related to more normative issues. We have like climate dimension, we have security dimension with Russia, we will have security dimension with critical raw materials, which all means additional costs, and it's all means that this affordability angle is more and more complex to be met.
I think, Antonia, you wanted to chip in as well.
I will be brief. Origin doesn't really matter because it's about the processing. So China is processing, I think, 90% of rare earth for manufacturing industries. So that's where the capabilities are limited when it comes to dependencies. It's basically us developing processing units that are in Europe, and then we can get rare earth from African countries or from Latin American countries. It's not an origin per se, but as Agata pointed out, it's we need to understand in depth what kind of dependency are we having on China, what can we do without, and what we cannot do without, because decoupling completely is not really a good solution, because we also lose competitivity if we get into full-fledged protectionist measures. And we should bear that in mind. I mean, protection, yes, but what is the level that actually allows us to be competitive?
I could add to this, and I would say that rules of origin don't really matter, because we could have them, and then what? We don't import anything. Like, I mean, to be fair, like, we don't have the capacity. Literally, it becomes that simple. We could have the highest restrictions and the highest things. We just don't get it. And as far as I'm concerned, with rare earths, these are elements that are unsubstitutable. So at that point, it's kind of like, what's the point of even having these rules if we can't even apply them? This doesn't say that it's not relevant to triangulate a plan to make a specific segments of the economy for specific things, for like highly precise, things like permanent magnets used in ICBMs or specific things like this. I think this is also why the United States Department of Defense has like an offtake contract with a mine in Australia, to make sure that they have guaranteed supply to a very specific end. But if we're talking about across the entire economy for a suite of metals, at this point in time, it's physically impossible for us to reduce dependency to a significant degree. That doesn't mean we shouldn't find a way there. It just means that the current state of affairs has to be acknowledged in a real, practical, pragmatic way.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
For me, maybe what is more preoccupying is that we actually do not know our value chain. I mean, it's really an issue that companies don't know where their metals are really coming from. They don't have a particular interest. Actually, we have seen the opposition towards CSRD, CSDD, which ask for, taking a deeper view in the value chains and seeing where do you import stuff from, what do you use, and based on which standards. And so I think we have a hard time knowing our supply chains. We are attempting to push companies to do this, but we see the resistance. So I think in the short term, it's actually impossible to implement them as long as we don't actually know where materials come from in the supply chain. And then taking a step forward, related to this processing part, once you have put rules of origin on certain steps, you have to make sure that you have in Europe the rest of the steps to reach the end, to have a final product. For instance, again, I'm repeating myself, we don't have enough PCAM, so precursor materials for cathodes, producer in Europe. So even if you have these materials on European soil, if you don't have the demand for them, they will have to go back to China for further refining and for PCAM production. So it's really a quite complex issue, and I think it's, for the short term, maybe it's not the most practical solution.
Yes, I would like to add to this processing thing, because indeed I think we need processing capacities in Europe. But then comes this my question about prioritization, because I understand that this is dirty business. No one wants these processing capacities because of its environmental impact. And that's why they were pushed away from Europe. And this is also the case of, for example, refineries in Europe. So, I mean, these strategic priorities and coherence about between different goals are urgently needed, actually.
Thanks a lot. Gata had another question on the need to create funds for transition minerals in Europe. Should we wait for the next MFF, or do we see opportunities before? A bit of hope on the Resource EU plan? Hope, anyone?
I just I can chip in. So I think in the short term is we can hope that the EIB will finally use. The EIB has committed to use 2 billion euros per year for investing in critical raw materials. They have adopted their critical raw material strategy. So let's hope that this will make a difference in the short term until we have the new MFF. It means that probably we can expect that they use guarantees or equity investments. The issue there is that EIB doesn't want to take risk. They want to fund only very good projects, also best standards from environmental perspective. Well, which is a good thing. I mean, we should strive for the best, but we need to look at the reality, and we have the strategic dependencies. We need to make sure that we are able to have partnerships where we can improve the mining, the processing, so we can enter a partnership and then work together towards improving. So investing in the improvement of decarbonization of those mines, of those processing facilities, because the reality is there. I mean, you have to have access to those metals in the short term. And then, of course, over the longer term, we can encourage even better projects. And what we see in Europe, for instance, in France, you have a lithium extraction project with really best standards. And of course, this should be supported. So I think the EIB is a tool. There are some other funds that maybe could be used in this direction, but Horizon Europe funds or other like innovation fund, but these are more like on the industrial side, so it won't help us really with the mines. So I think we should still have hope for the MFF, and we should push for member states and parliament to keep this critical raw materials ambition. We need to build a culture. And I have to say that this is not acquired. We could think that after so many years of discussion, everyone understands critical raw materials, everyone knows the problems and the importance. It's not actually that obvious. So we need to build up let's say the argumentary to make sure that there will be funding in the new MFF for this.
Which is quite optimistic. There is Jeanne asking, how can we consider both strategic communications and strategic ambiguity so that the enemy does not know how all of our capabilities, or should they know as a deterrent strategy? Well, which capabilities? Who wants to? Yeah, Antonia.
I talked about strategic communications as a need to implement in the energy security planning, policy, and strategy. I do not know how to answer that question because I'm not a specialist. A specialist would know what to answer. But coming from a country where secret is more relevant sometimes to strategic communications than anything else, I will say that that's not the path. So yes, there is a balance in between. Some things do not need to be in the open, but others work as deterrents if they are communicated effectively. So yeah, there is a balance. I don't know which one and how to do it, but deterrence is there.
Difficult to say.
If I could add to that, I think also it's important to communicate intent. And I think the one example that I would refer to is the recent response from Poland and the Baltic states, hardening and strengthening their energy infrastructure, specifically in direct response to the Russian drone and jet incursion into their airspace. As far as I recall, there was a joint request for several hundred million euros from the EU funding to strengthen and harden this infrastructure. In Germany, the conversation is deeply different, would probably be a polite phrase, because essentially we've had Lieutenant General Bodemann and Zollfrank encouraging the private sector to invest in strengthening their own infrastructure, which is something I would disagree with. But in general, I think that this is important to convey publicly. To convey the specifics of it might not be relevant because that's obviously relevant to security, but to convey publicly very, very concretely that we are doing this in direct response to something, and to show publicly that we're strengthening the infrastructure in direct response to things, I think is very, very important, because it shows why we are doing something. And I think that that's specifically important to communicate to voters and the society amidst constrained budgets. You're not just saying, hey, I'm spending €500 million on hardening on energy infrastructure. You're saying this has directly happened. I'm spending this as a direct consequence of escalation. And you're communicating this transparently. I think this is how you convey the strategic context to your populations.
Thanks. Anonymous, what role will Russia have in the EU in a post-Ukraine war world? If this means more Russian cheap gas into the EU, can this slow down the energy transition somehow? Well, valid question. What to do with Russia after the war?
So first we have to have war finished, yes, and a just peace in Ukraine, and I think we're a long way from that, unfortunately. And then second thing is that, as far as I understand, the current works of European Commission on regulation to phase out Russian gas are not about permanent temporary measures, but about permanent phase out, which means that, well, after the war, we would need A, change of EU law, B, new contracts to be signed, and what is even more serious from a legal situation, which is kind of developing, is that I understand that we have trust that was broken among partners. And you said, Mario, while summing up our first part, that what we need to survive crisis is a deep reform of the system. And I think this is one of the elements of this reform. Actually, the old world will not be back. And we don't know what will be the new world, but for sure, there will be not that much of a completely free trade and coming back to old past dependencies.
Right. Another question from Anonymous wants to know what exactly the panelist's view is on the term nuclear. Is it A, the solution for European independence, B, European resilience, or C, C, a low carbon, competitively priced supply of electricity?
I don't think it's A, B, or C. I mean, I think nuclear is important for the European electricity system. 25% of our electricity, it's low carbon electricity, and we need it in our energy transition. We need it also for our energy security. So yes, it matches all these objectives. Then, of course, I think we should bear in mind that every state can decide for itself if it wants or not nuclear energy. It's absolutely a national decision, national mix, energy mix, and just as a mention that, of course, we see a lot of nuclear plants, a lot of plans for new nuclear plants, but it will take time. And you have to factor this in. I mean, if we have the plan today on the table, it means that the facility will come in 10, 15 years. So we need to have a plan for the next 10, 15 years. So it means still a lot of renewables that have to be added in the European energy system as a matter of energy security. And renewables, it's a very high level term. When I say it, I don't only mean solar and wind, but I also think about hydro. I also think about storage, which is absolutely a huge issue. And I also think about molecules, so renewable hydrogen, biogas, everything that we can add and that can enhance our energy independence. But of course, nuclear is part of the European energy mix, and it will continue to be so. And maybe one last thing, we need to make sure that we are able to position ourselves on the next generation of nuclear plants, so the SMR, the AMR. And here it's probably also a question of what we want as Europeans. Do we want to have our own technologies? How far would you like to go in terms of supporting them? Should we collaborate? Should we compete? Should we do both? Also with the US, wants to develop its SMR strategy in Europe, so they see this as a way of building their pipeline of projects, of reducing the costs for their own industries. I think we probably will need to cooperate with the US on this, but we also need, as Europeans, to be able to define our standards, to work together, and to make emerge these new technologies, because nuclear is part of the low carbon technologies world.
Thank you. Yeah, Loyal and I fear also Agatha need to go fairly quickly, and I would like to thank them both. Let me maybe just say that as an Austrian, I will abstain from saying anything on the nuclear. Our nation's main constituent elements are neutrality and being against nuclear energy. But what I can maybe add is that I had a very interesting conversation recently with a entrepreneur who is producing basically green baseload, so really combining solar and wind power capacities with huge battery systems and being able to basically do what originally gas turbines or also nuclear power plants were able to do. And I think that is certainly also an avenue that which we should explore and follow more deeply. A final question from Louise, and with a hopefully more optimistic note, she says that several projects regarding raw materials extraction, treatment and recycling have been launched across Europe. If it put enough money and political will in it, to what extent do you think we could rely on our own European raw materials supply chain to contribute to our needs?
Go ahead, Antonia.
Yeah.
I will say that this was addressed earlier, and what I will add is that political will is in everything, and if we deal with this matter of Critical Minerals Act and rare earths supply chain is very important. So what Diana pointed out earlier, and I think Agatha as well, knowing what is actually that we are dependent on, where and how, is key to understand the problem that we are dealing with. And then we have the political level to implement and the political will, but not until we explain this to the population, because I think that there was a core point made that the population does not necessarily understand why we need this in the first place. It's not obvious.
And I'll just also add the factor of time. I mean, it would be, so assuming this ideal situation, there is money, there is political willingness, there is social acceptability, there is also a question of time. So opening a new mine takes 10, 15 years. Maybe we can manage to do it in 7 years, but let's say that's really, really idealistic. So it's still a period of time. So we need to factor this in. And then you, of course, need the industry to be there and be ready to modify its supply chains to consume European production. That means that you probably need some sort of obligation combined with some sort of protection mechanisms at the border, because Chinese metals will continue to be, in the international market will continue to be cheaper than European production. So you need to find a way to make sure it stays in Europe, it's used by industry. So there is offtake. Offtake is actually a key word in this sector. And unfortunately, because of the price volatility that you see now on the markets, there is so little incentive to open new mines, new refining capacities. So yeah, that's that factor of offtake and time. factoring in the time is absolutely important. So this is why I come back on the issue of recycling and saying that we really need to be more strategic about recycling what is already in Europe.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank also our fabulous audience, which is here with us still in large numbers. I would like to thank all the most knowledgeable panelists. I would like to thank obviously everyone who was involved in organizing this great webinar, and particularly our hosts from the Centre Franco-Autrichien pour le Rapprochement en Europe. And I would hence like to hand over back to Ambassador Schweißgut. Dietmar, please have some concluding words.
Well, thank you very much, Mario. I think I will not really add to a very rich conversation, which already went quite a bit over the time allotted, which shows not only the great interest, but also I think the fascinating sort of discussion we had, thanks to a wonderful panel. Let me just make one comment, which is not directly related to many issues which were raised in the debate, but which was also made, I think, by a number of panelists in sort of adding up to the substance. It has been said at the beginning that the notion of strategic autonomy is something which has moved on from being perceived as sort of a French hobby to something which has become mainstream and which is considered to be a strategic necessity. On the other hand, it was also pointed out on various occasions that obviously there are still various interpretations of that, and fragmentation is still a real issue. Now, how to overcome that does not only depend on that has been pointed out on the political will and on the financing, but there's also the need to carry the population, which in many, if not most countries, has become more skeptical about European solutions. How to convince our populations that it is those European solutions and their coherence, which also carries benefit at a very concrete level. And a number of them have been pointed out. And I think unless we are able to explain why this has to be done and in reaction to what and what exactly this will mean, including costs and not only benefits, but I think that has to be pointed out. And in addition to that, I think this was also a comment which was made a little bit on the side, but which reserves, I think, great attention, is that obviously energy cost, the price of electricity, how to address very concrete issues of daily lives. This is something which we should not forget in a sort of very broad strategic discussion on which the panel could probably more easily agree than this would be the case if we had an open public discussion in our member states. But I do think that today's discussion has contributed to sort of identify and to clarify a number of issues. And I would like to thank the panel, you, Mario, for your expert chairmanship of this. And with that, once again, thanks to all of you, to the audience, and to our partners, WIIW and IFRI in Paris.